Thank you, David.
Where do you want to stick in the first part?
After the first couple of sentences.
I'll let you do it.
Okay.
So, as David said, we were appointed by the International Mission Board, Southern Baptist, in 1985. And we scooped up our 2 preschoolers and hauled them overseas. When we agreed to go to Gaza, we did not have any kind of political agenda. We didn't know anything about politics. We didn't have an eschatology formed. All we had was a call to missions and a burning need to answer the request that the Gaza Baptist Nursing School had. So Paul's a nurse, and he filled that position. Most of the students in the nursing school were male, and they were desperate for Christian males to model Christian behavior. And so that's the need that we went to fill. As we prepared to go, so it's 1985, all right? No internet, anything like that, but we looked at pictures and read articles and looked at people's slides, if you can imagine that.
That's before their time.
Yes. Nothing, and I mean nothing, could prepare us for life in Gaza. The first days when we looked out our windows and women were covered head to toe in black, carrying children on their shoulders or big, huge burdens on their heads, or men walking down the street in the jalabiya, the typical dress. They wore that. Donkey carts and animals milling in the street, and thousands of people. Men in the front seat, women in the goats in the back seats. Nothing could prepare us for Gaza.
Now, Gaza is almost the center of our universe, but we realize that there is a big universe out there, and you may not really know where Gaza is, although I hope by now you've heard of it. So, in case it's a little foggy, let me give a quick review of some geography and history. Gaza is a city on the southwestern border of what's now Israel. Gaza's mentioned in the Bible. Samson pulled down the pillars of the temple in Gaza, so it's still there all these centuries later. And now Palestinians call it home. In Arabic, that's Philistine. They're not related to the Philistines of the Bible. There may be some Philistine DNA in their blood, but they are an accumulation of all the peoples that have lived there in the past. They count the Canaanites as their forefathers. And there's actually never been a country of Palestine. It was an occupied or a part of the Byzantine Empire. In 1948, when the country of Israel was formed, Israel did not conquer what we now call the Gaza Strip. So it became the Gaza Strip in the southwest corner of Israel, and the West Bank, which is in the middle of the country along the eastern border, became occupied territories of Israel. In 1967, there was another war, and they occupied those areas at that time. So when we went in 1985, Israeli soldiers patrolled the streets. There was an Israeli in charge of every aspect of life there.
That first morning, he was like a caged animal. As we looked out the window, he would go from one side of the apartment to the other side of the apartment, and I finally said, "Go walk around the block. You can do that and find your way back."
And when I came back in, I said, "Harriet, whatever these guys paid for their car horns, they got a bargain." Now, I have never heard so many cars we always said if they go 50 meters, they just or 50 yards, they're obliged to blow their horn just to make sure it's still working. But living in that third world country and learning to speak Arabic proved to be incredibly difficult. As Harriet said, we did all we could to prepare for it before we went overseas, but the reality of it was even more difficult. In those days, there weren't really any restaurants in Gaza, but the United Nations had a recreational facility for their personnel and allowed us to go there as well. And the name of that was the Gaza Strip Club, or the Gaza Strip Club. That's as naughty as missionaries are allowed to be. But anyway, they had a lifeguard. In addition to the restaurant, they had a lifeguard. It's right there on the sea. And Harriet would take Bonnie and Ben, our preschoolers, and sit on the patio and pray that somehow we would absorb the Arabic as they played in the surf. So it was hard, but it was also very rewarding. Harriet mentioned that I taught in the School of Nursing. We saw lives really changed by that ministry. Most of our students were from the refugee camps. Their families had no education. We typically had 800 to 1,000 students apply for the 15 places in the School of Nursing. And so we changed their trajectory by providing them a means of earning a living. We also changed the healthcare system for the Gaza Strip. Even by the time we got there, our graduates, there was a government school of nursing, but our graduates filled all the leadership positions in healthcare. So we were influencing all the healthcare of Gaza. But there was another reason that it was so fulfilling. And for example, one day I had a plumbing problem, and I called Akram, the plumber. And I knew that Akram lived near the Turkish bath, Hammam al-Samra. And I had been wanting to go, so I asked him about it, and he said, yeah, he went all the time. So that Friday morning, Akram and I went to the Turkish bath together. And the proprietor was very proud that there was a foreigner there, and he showed us all around and said that the hammam, the Turkish bath, had been there for thousands of years. Well, one of the other members of our team was a historian, and he said that was a gross exaggeration. It's probably only about 800 years old. So we went into the heated part and stayed there for a while, came back out, and we were sitting in the cooling off area on a stone bench all around. I was talking to Akram on my right, and the man on my left was from Jabalia, the largest refugee camp in the area. And he said to me, are you a Christian? And I said, yes. And he said, I can tell by your face. Now, he probably meant he could tell I was a foreigner and thinking all foreigners are Christian. But that's not what he said. He said, I can tell you're a Christian by your face. There were a lot of reasons for him to identify me as a foreigner. Although I was speaking with Akram in Arabic, I was pretty good in Arabic by that time. In 30 years, I never lost my Alabama accent. So he could tell I was a foreigner by my accent. I have an olive complexion, but a little lighter than most Palestinians, so he could tell that I was a foreigner by my skin color. I was the only one there with plaid boxer shorts. It's against Islam for men to see each other naked, so everybody had on either their underwear or a towel or whatever, but I was the only one dressed that way. There were a lot of reasons for him to identify me as a foreigner, but he said, I can tell you're a Christian by your face. And that kind of became a goal for me, that the people we met, most of them day by day had never met a follower of Jesus, that they could tell that I was a Christian by my face, by my hands and feet, that we carried the love of Christ with us wherever we went.
I'm supposed to tell you now what it was like under the occupation, and a little bit about the first Intifada. That's almost impossible to do. The occupation, there were some good things about the occupation. When Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, there was freedom of movement during this first season. 120 men and women. 120,000 men and women left daily about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and they filled the lowest jobs up in Israel. But they were very thankful for their jobs, and it gave them a livelihood. They returned in the evenings about 4 or 5 o'clock and cleaned up and put on their jalabiyas and sat in the sand and drank tea and concentrated on the lovely family that they were providing for. I mean, so there were some good things that happened during the occupation. But there were also some really hard things. As Paul said, Israel controlled every aspect of life. That's difficult. Young men, Israelis, have to sign up for the army at age 18, maybe 19. And so patrols of young Israeli men patrolled the cities, and they did difficult things. They degraded people in unspeakable ways. Oftentimes, as I drove through town, I would tell my children in the back seat, down in the back. And that meant they had to get down on the floor in the back. Not really because it wasn't safe, although we did have a period of that as well, but more because I didn't want their young hearts to see what bad thing was happening on the sides of the road that the Israeli soldiers were doing to Palestinians who had our hearts by this time, you know. So it was difficult during those years. In 1987, this was just a couple of years into our, first term there, we could tell that things were getting more and more tense. So we're still newbies. We don't really understand this, We're still trying to get the culture, only 2 years in. But if I had my eyes closed, I could have told you when we crossed the border between Israel and Gaza, just by the oppression that I felt in my spirit. I didn't even know what a spirit of discernment was at that time. I didn't know I had it. I was so young and inexperienced. But I absolutely could tell you, oh, well, we're in Gaza now, because the pressure was so tense. And so by a series of events at the end of that year that led up to December 9th, when an Israeli man, in retribution, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, this is how they live, you know that, in a very large truck ran over a small car full of Palestinians and killed most of the people in it, and then some of them were in the hospital. And we lived probably 5 blocks from the government hospital, and we could hear long before we ever saw the people from Jabalia camp as they marched, probably about 5 miles maybe, it was a pretty far piece, the mob as they came, shouting, and that was the beginning of what was known as the Intifada. And Intifada means shaking off, like a dog would shake off water or something off its back, and it's the term that Palestinians use to mean the shaking off the Israeli rule. And so we had the early Intifada, and then the so far second Intifada, and until now we haven't had the third Intifada.
So during the Intifada, the first Intifada uprising, commonly called in English, Palestinians didn't really have any weapons. And one of the things that the way they fought against the Israelis is by throwing rocks. So the Palestinians were armed with rocks, and there are a lot of rocks. And the Israelis had machine guns. A couple of other things that happened during those days, and as a form of protest, the Palestinians would call strikes. And that meant that all the businesses were closed, and only emergency vehicles were allowed to drive. People could walk, and the donkey carts could go we made a number of trips to visit neighbors or friends on the back of a donkey cart.
That was a sight to see.
Yeah. Our friends couldn't believe that we had come in a donkey cart, but quite an experience for us and our kids. The other thing, and there would be 2 or 3 strikes a week. So schools were closed, not much education, not much work
So this is what the Palestinians did to themselves, and it was a form of nonviolent rebellion, which did help, and it didn't do anything for Gaza, but it also happened in Jerusalem. And so it was good for the Palestinians in that it really hurt Israeli economy, the tourist business, which is the basis of their economy.
The other thing that would happen are curfews, and those were called when there was an incident somewhere, perhaps not in Gaza, but in Israel itself or in the West Bank. Israel would impose a curfew, which meant that people had to stay in their homes. So sometimes it would last a day or two. Several times we were not allowed to get out in the street for a week at a time.
So imagine being a Palestinian living in the refugee camp with 8 or 10 or 12 children living in 3 rooms for days on end. Yeah. Not fun.
As that first uprising was drawing to a close, I visited a friend. He invited me for lunch, just me. Often we would go as a family, but that time I went alone. He met me at the door and invited me in. We sat on foam rubber mats on the floor, no furniture except those. At night they were where people slept at day, and during the day they were the couches and chairs. We sat on the floor. After a while, his wife or mother came to the door. I couldn't see her. She was still beyond my sight. She cleared her throat, and he got up and got the tray with our food, and we ate together from the common dish. I was fortunate. They did give me a spoon. Sometimes you would eat in homes and eat just with your fingers. Usually they could find the spoon, and that's a lot more difficult than you would think. To eat rice with fingers is a challenge. But as we ate, we talked about the Intifada, and he said a lot of people around the world think that we're crazy for throwing rocks at soldiers who have machine guns, knowing that they can shoot us and kill us. But our lives are no different than being dead. And, I remember that comment because it made me think, this is the definition of hopelessness. To think that your life is no different than being dead. And I remembered the verse from 1 Peter chapter 3 that says, always give an answer for the hope that you have. And it was a privilege to share with him that day the hope that we have because of our relationship with Christ.
So we rocked along. In 1994, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres and Yasser Arafat, President Clinton and King Hussein of Jordan brokered a deal for peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis and the withdrawal of the Israelis out of Gaza. So that was supposed to happen on May the 19th at 3 a.m. in the morning. So we had 2 preteens by this time, and we realized this is a history event, an important event in history. And yes, you can stay up until 4 o'clock in the morning to watch this happen. And so we had 2 of our journeymen came down, and so all of the, 6 of us joined the thousands and thousands and thousands of people out in the street, went around the corner. So we were a block, literally, from the roof of our house. We could see the government buildings behind us. And so we went around to try to get, to where we could see. And there was a mob. And anyway, so tear gas. We were shot with tear gas because they had to quell the mob until 3 a.m. And so we ran back home, got the onions, cut the onions, put the onions on our eyes, and that helps take away the tear gas. But eventually we just said no, and our two journeymen especially weren't going to be held back. And so we climbed over the wall behind our house and went into the churchyard behind us and peeked over the wall to see what was happening. And at 3 a.m., oh my goodness, there was so much shooting you cannot imagine. And so, of course, we were ducked down on the ground, covering
We just
our
thought
children.
people were being killed by the hundreds.
Thought it was a bloodbath. We just couldn't imagine that it had gotten to this. And but that's not what had happened at all. And eventually we heard happy sounds, and what it was just celebratory shooting up in the air. But you guys know what comes up has to come down, so we didn't keep the kids out there too long. With no control over the journeymen, they were gone out into the crowd. And but it was a joyous time, and we were privileged to be able to see a historic event and a great event in history.
And that ushered in the time of when the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat, came as the head of the Palestinian Authority. And as it was about to happen, and we talked with Palestinians, they described what life was going to be like under the Palestinian Authority. And I can remember thinking, heaven is not going to be this good. No taxes, everybody has work, everybody flourishes. And of course, their expectations were so high that they were met miserably. And in fact, by 2000, their lives were worse than they had been under Israeli occupation. And so a second intifada started. That second intifada was a lot more violent because by now the Palestinians were armed. And so they were able to cause more damage to Israelis. About 1,000 Israelis were killed, 6,500 Palestinians. And that never came to a specific end. It just kind of petered out over time. In the spring of 2002, Israel invaded again both Gaza and the West Bank. And the result was really a humanitarian crisis. People were without food and without places to live. And we were able, through the Baptist disaster relief mechanism, to request funds and volunteers who came overseas and helped us distribute food. I don't know if you have read the book The Insanity of God by Nick Ripken, or maybe saw the premiere of the film on Tuesday night. But we met with Nick just before we started that project, and he told us about his work in Somalia and how people really the Somali people really wanted an opportunity to tell their story. So as our volunteers came, we asked them to sit with the Palestinians that they met and ask what had happened. And if it was true for them, it was also true for us. That was really the impact of our project. People just having the opportunity to tell how they had been injured and what had happened to them.
Over and over again, people said, thank you for the food, but thank you most of all for listening to our story, because they felt like they were disenfranchised and that the world didn't hear their story. Nobody's taking notes in here. You're not supposed to, but write that down. Listen to their stories.
Yeah. In one home our volunteers visited, there was a widow, an elderly widow, and when they got ready to go, she wouldn't let them leave. She said, when you came into my home, light came in, and I don't want you to go out. And the only way we were able to finally leave is to promise to go back again another time.
During this time, or at the end of the worst of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, I experienced compassion fatigue. And I finally looked at my sweet husband and said, we can do a lot of things. We can go to China, we can go to Jordan, we can go to Birmingham, we can do a lot of things, but we're not staying in Gaza. And so after 17 years, we left. And
moved to the West Bank. Actually, we moved to Jerusalem, which is just over the hill from the West Bank. And we were able to continue to go into Gaza up until the time we retired last fall. Life now in Gaza is even worse than it was when we were there. The people cannot leave. When we first went to Gaza, a little bit fewer than 600,000 people live there. Now about 1.8 million. So it's becoming more and more crowded, fewer and fewer resources. Harriet mentioned 120,000 people went to work in Israel when we first got there. Now none. No one goes in. It's one of the highest unemployment rates in the world.
When we, either our first or second furlough, as we came home, we looked at the statistics. I haven't looked recently, but so this was 20 years ago. Gaza was then the second most crowded place in the world according to landmass. And so we've tripled the size, the number of people in that amount of years. It is one crowded place.
So at the time of our move, we had changed the focus of our work. We had become team leaders in charge of the IMB work among Palestinians, not just in Gaza and the West Bank, but in Jordan. And back in that war in 1948, Palestinians went everywhere. And so we also had team working with them in Jordan and for a while Lebanon and Syria as well. We retired last fall, but even in the last couple of years before retirement, I was able to be a part of a project that distributed wheelchairs to needy people in villages south of Bethlehem, down towards Hebron. And even until today, it was a privilege for us to be in many different homes ministering to people who had never met a believer in Jesus. And so, you think Bethlehem is where it all started, but very, very close to there, people still don't know much about him.
Sometime, I don't know when, during this series of years, close towards the end of our time in Gaza, we also went to a conference that the IMB had, and everyone in the region was required to go. And a couple was there who had been on our team and lived in Gaza with us for 1 4-year term, and then they left and went to another country, no problem. But she stood up and gave testimony, and she said, well, I went to school in Gaza. I didn't hear anything else after that. I don't know what she said, because Paul and I both just kind of looked at each other. We were still in Gaza. And I think our hearts, I don't know what they did. Somehow we both thought, why can't we graduate from school in Gaza? Everybody else graduated from school in Gaza. We had sent missionaries all over the Middle East and the world, Africa and the world. But we were still in Gaza. But eventually we came to love school in Gaza because that's where the Lord taught us great lessons.
And we want to share some of those lessons with you today. Some of the things that God taught us in these difficult circumstances.
But you're going to have to talk to Pass.
Okay. That's impossible. So one night after church, there is a Baptist church in Gaza. One night after church, we were talking with Abu Shukri, one of our friends, and Abu Shukri said, he was talking about how wonderful Gaza was. And he said, the weather is perfect.
Well, it doesn't get to 100 very often. It didn't get below freezing very often, but I have never spent a colder winter than when we were in Gaza.
He said the food is delicious.
Now that's true. The food is absolutely wonderful.
He said the terrain is beautiful.
Well, it does have wide beaches. Anyway, it's on the Mediterranean. Who can say anything bad about that?
And the people are wonderful.
Oh, the people are just wonderful. They are just wonderful.
But at the end of all these wonderful things he said about Gaza, he said, it just needs a bit of organizing.
Oh, my goodness. Did it need a bit of organizing? You just cannot imagine.
Not long after that, I had some busy work to do during the day, a lot of errands to run, and I ended up having just a really bad day. It started off, I went to the office. The last couple of blocks before I got to the office was a one-way street. I was traveling in the right direction on the one-way street, but I was having to dodge cars coming at me the wrong way, but they were blowing their horns at me like I was the one going the wrong way. Now, there's never been enough electricity in Gaza, so what they do is they rotate blackouts. So one section will have no electricity for a while, maybe a few hours, or maybe a day or two. 2 Christmases in a row, we did not have electricity on New Year's Eve, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, because it just was our turn to be without.
It was hard.
So we didn't have any electricity at the office. I had to go across town to make copies. Did that. I went to the visa office. We were very fortunate that visas were always a challenge. We were very fortunate at that time to be able to get a visa. But I sat 30 minutes and waited for them to find my passport. I had given them my passport. They were supposed to stamp it with a visa, and a simple procedure. I was off to go. They couldn't find it. They looked everywhere. Finally, after a half an hour of waiting, they found it. Someone had used it to stabilize a wobbly table. And there it was on the floor. So when I got home that day, I said, Harriet, I don't think I can do this another 15 years.
I don't have any idea what was happening the next day. Neither of us remember, but I do remember that I said to him, well, you only have to do it tomorrow.
When you go to the Middle East, you have to ask the question, are you willing to die for the sake of the gospel? It's not just a rhetorical question. We had a couple of our co-workers, a local Palestinian and an IMB single lady, who were killed. People who worked directly with us. Others were also killed, including Martha Myers, a Samford grad and Alabama native that you're going to hear about later in this Global Voices series. So it's a real question that has to be answered. Not only that, you have to ask your question, are you up for the big test? Or are you going to be like Peter and deny Christ at the critical time? During the Olympics this past summer, maybe you saw the trailer for a film that actually will come out next week called Sully. It stars Tom Hanks, who's stars as the airplane pilot who landed his jet in the Hudson River back a few years ago. And in the movie, Tom Hanks, as Sully, says, I've been a pilot for 40 years, and in the end, my work is going to be judged on 208 seconds. So you have to be ready for the big test.
Most of us, most of you, will not be called on to die. Many of you won't even have a big test. But we all are going to have to deal with the daily grind. And we learned through the years in school in Gaza that it's the daily grind that will get you. Don't be caught off guard by the small things.
A couple of weeks ago, there was a flood in southern Louisiana. You probably heard about it. 13 people were killed, 100,000 homes were damaged. And last weekend, I had the privilege of joining others in going to the Baton Rouge area to help these people who have lost literally everything in their home. We worked with the Baptist Disaster Relief, but there was a Vineyard Church there working alongside us, and 30 girls from Harding University, the girls softball team, came and worked with us. And it was just a real privilege to be a part of that group. But here we were, strangers to each other, helping strangers, regardless of background. And, it just reminded me that a crisis like this often brings out the best in people.
But it also brings out the worst. It doesn't really bring out the worst, but whatever your negative personality trait is a crisis or ongoing stress will bring that to the top. Write that down. We had somebody on our team who was a neatnik. She was a self-proclaimed neatnik, and she cleaned her floors every day. I didn't clean my floors every day. If I got them once a week, we were doing well. During stressful times, she admitted she would mop her floors 3 or 4 times a day. If you were an organized person, you wanted your life to be organized, you made your plans, and you wanted these plans to happen, and that we didn't have electricity, and sometimes you couldn't travel, and you can imagine how difficult that was. If you were critical, nothing was right. We experienced all of those things.
I'm a creative thinker, and during times of difficulty, I spend way too much time daydreaming. But all these idiosyncrasies that these other people have can make life difficult. And at first, when we were dealing with these difficult people, we did what most Christians would do when they're confronted with people like this.
We talked about them behind their back.
Is it true or not? Yeah, it's true. I was the director of the School of Nursing, and this over-organizer was the assistant director. I would come in with my wild ideas, and the next day she would come back with a plan to implement this. I wouldn't know, what are you talking about? She was driving me crazy. But eventually I came to the point of realizing not only was she driving me crazy, but I was driving her crazy with my flight of ideas.
Eventually we really learned about God's grace. God's grace is unmerited favor. And during stressful times, and you will, whatever you do in your life, you will have ongoing stressful times. You'll have somebody in your church that just drives you crazy. And you've got to pull on God's grace. The overabundance of grace that God has given to you, you must grace others with.
In the West Bank now is the end of fig season. Probably most of you didn't even know there was a fig season. But in Deuteronomy 8, verse 8, it talks about the 7 species. And that the 2 grains and 5 fruits, and figs are among those 5 fruits. So this was from the time of Moses. So figs have been around in the Holy Land for a long, long time.
I'm trying to hurry because time is going. So I won't retell the tale, but in Matthew 21, you remember the story when Jesus saw the fig tree. This was in springtime. He got angry that there was no fruit, and he said, "You won't bear fruit anymore."
And when we lived in a house in Bethlehem, we had 6 fig trees in our yard. And one of the things I learned about figs is that in the springtime, they have some what are called in Arabic dafour figs. These grow on last year's growth, on the last year's limbs, and they're just a few. And the ones in my yard would usually drop off. You can eat them, but there are not very many of them. The fig fact that really caught my attention was this. If you don't have dafour figs in the spring, then you're not going to have a crop in the summer.
And that's what Jesus knew.
So yeah, when Jesus looked at that tree, there weren't any dafour figs on it. He knew that there wasn't going to be any figs in the summer. And that really captured my thoughts, my heart and mind, but because I realized that's also true spiritually. If we're going to have a spiritual maturity in the summer, whatever that happens to be, then there's got to be some preparation, some signs of maturity in the spring. Psalm 1 said, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in the step of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree," maybe a fig tree, "planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season." Your academic preparation is important, no matter how you plan to serve the Lord. And we urge you to take advantage of that, of every opportunity. But as important as that academic preparation is, it's not a substitute for your spiritual preparation. It's been our experience that God does not allot spiritual strength in 15-year intervals, or even a month at a time. And people often ask us, how did we live in Gaza and the West Bank for 30 years? And the answer is one day at a time with the strength that God provided. So your ability to endure and even thrive in difficult times, and your strength and wisdom that you'll need to face whatever big test that you have, and your love for people who are unlovable is going to come from the Lord. And it comes one day at a time, built on the preparation that you're putting in right now.
So Paul and I went to school in Gaza. God will put you through another school, some other place, most likely not Gaza. Our prayer is that you'll have a soft heart and a teachable spirit, and that you can learn the lessons that life brings you in whatever school it is that God provides for you. And now we'd love to have questions.
Yeah, come on, David.
All right, I will point for and choose whose questions asking. First, I'm going to choose me. I have a question. I'm going to start first.
Okay.
Missionaries typically, almost inevitably, strongly side with the people they serve when it comes to any political problem. What was it like when you were around missionaries to the Jews in Israel? Did you ever have conversation? Because their experience would be seeing terrorist attacks. Did you ever have those conversations? Did it ever get difficult there? And can you kind of, I don't know if that's going to come up on the mic, can you repeat at least the basics of the question?
So we're serving the Palestinian people. There are strong political leanings or theological leanings one way or the other between Palestinians and Israelis. How is it to work and fellowship with people who work with the Israelis?
So I'm going to answer this. I guess I've had the most recent experience with this. In 2014, there was a war against Gaza. Palestinians are never innocent, okay? We love Palestinians. I can't convey that enough. And there are no good guys over there. Everybody's doing wrong stuff, okay? So we're also not blind to the wrong that happens. So I just want to put that in there. But we love Palestinians. And during the war, it was a very uneven war. And they were just being obliterated. Whole neighborhood, y'all, are gone. And they still today haven't been, nothing's happened in them. Those beautiful homes are just gone. But so during this, we watch it. We were watching it from afar. We were living in Bethlehem by this time. And my best friend, who works with the Israelis, texted me. Talking on the phone was too hard, so we texted on the computer and said, I'm praying for the innocent women and children. And I just said, who is going to pray for the guilty? So it doesn't matter. I had to stretch my tent stakes and pray for the Israelis who were doing awful things to my people. And she had to stretch her tent stakes and begin to pray for Palestinians who also were doing some awful things. So it works both ways. We all always work on it. It isn't easy, and there are some things that we just agree not to talk about.
Okay.
You mentioned you had a church. What did ministry look like for the church? And to tack onto that, what did kind of contextualization look like for you guys?
When we first went to Gaza, the church looked just like any little Baptist church in Alabama. We sang hymns straight out of the Baptist hymnal. Translated a lot of them from German to English and then to Arabic. Took up the offering and had a sermon. As many churches now have evolved, they now sing worship songs that are written in Arabic. there is a Christian presence that always has been in Gaza. When we first went, there were about 3,000 Christians, primarily culturally Christian. They were born into a Greek Orthodox family. A few of them became believers. Some of those believers were in the Baptist church. Now there's about 800 or 1,000 because they have left.
I would say that there are more believers even in the traditional churches today,
Right.
and that's great. One thing that happened during when the Gaza Strip closed, so we mentioned that no one can get out, was that they had to stay for university. And so we had a great Sunday school and a great youth program. And then prior to this, they would go out to university, marry somebody out, stay out if they could. And even if they came back, oftentimes they didn't come back to the church. But when the strip closed and Israel no longer allowed anyone to get out, no one gets out, then that kept everybody in, and they had to go to university in. They married Gaza Christian girls, and so they stayed, and they also stayed in the church, and that has benefited the church. We had a real crisis when we had 4 or 5 kids in this Sunday nursery again, so it's worked both ways for us.
Yeah.
Contextualization, I did not cover the whole time that I lived in Gaza City because we had a Christian community, and they would not have blessed me covering. A little bit during the worst days of the Intifada, I put a headscarf on because it was kind of like to be a good Muslim, to be a good person, you were also a good Muslim. And to be in our court, you had to be a good Muslim a little bit. And so a few times I would wear it. At one point, we lived in the south of the Gaza Strip, and we were the only believers there. One other foreigner in this town, and I did cover. I covered for the 3 years that we lived down there. And always wore long sleeved, and and then he was normal, plain old.
Yes, ma'am.
The first time I went to Israel, we stayed in Bethlehem at a hospital run by Lebanese nuns. The mayor of Bethlehem was Christian, and knew several Christians who lived in Bethlehem who were Palestinians. But then, several years later, I don't remember when, went back, and there were no Christians in Bethlehem that were not undercover or so. And we had a meal there, but it was under very strange circumstances. Can you tell me what happened?
So, what about the Christians? The Christians in Bethlehem. They used to be a lot more vocal and seen. And your last visit, it was a difficult experience. What year was your second visit or the last visit?
It may have been 2002. It's hard for me to remember. I don't have
That makes sense now.
I mentioned that humanitarian crisis in 2002. That was a very difficult time. And periodically, things happen politically that limit tourist traveling in the West Bank. In past times, there are 3 towns that are together. Bethlehem is the center, and then one on either side that are predominantly Christian. And Bethlehem is now predominantly Muslim, and the reason for that is, just like everywhere in the world, people from the villages are moving into the city. So the Muslim villages are moving into the Bethlehem area. Muslims typically have more children. Christians are, in the past, have better education and more relatives outside, and so they can immigrate out easier.
So the Christians were always there. You
And
just
they're
didn't
still
see
there.
them.
Yeah, they're still there. Not in the numbers, but the strong presence.
How available are Bibles and other Christian literature for y'all to do evangelism and discipleship?
In the West Bank, it's not a problem. Like Paul said, we still have a bit of a Christian population. It's not a problem, easy to get in.
In Gaza, I took some Bibles with me one time into Gaza, and they were taken by the Hamas at the Hamas checkpoint.
I smuggled Bibles in my purse because they wouldn't check my purse. Every time, everything had to be checked once Hamas took over in Gaza. I put them underneath my legs, like right behind my legs as I was sitting in the car, because they would most of the time allow me just to stay seated, and so we could get, but this is one or two that we were getting in each time we went. So getting new Bibles into Gaza is a problem.
But even in the West Bank, if a Muslim, the Bible Society advertises and they can receive one in the mail, but in I call the corners, the small villages where there's 100% Muslim, it's difficult even now. It's technically available, but practically speaking, it's unavailable. But everybody's connected to the internet, and they can receive it that way.
Okay.
You guys are a quiet group.
All right, well, I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and if there's not another question, then I'll go ahead and close this in prayer.
I was going to ask another one.
Well, okay. We're not praying.
Sorry. Almost. Well, from your ministry then, what does it kind of look like now, the ministry of the church, or even how do you communicate the gospel to people, even now?
Rami Ayad, a Palestinian, was killed how many years ago? 8 years ago. And he worked for the Bible Society, and a number of people who worked for the Bible Society and Campus Crusade, local people, left. All those, not all,
the
but
church left.
Yeah, many of those families that Harriet mentioned that had married each other and had babies. The strength of the church left. But their parents are there, and 30 years ago when we attended the church, there were a lot of old women and maybe one or two old men. Now it's filled with old men. So we'd like some young men too, but having those heads of family really helps. They have a pastor from Egypt, Maher, Hannah Maher, and he's doing a great job. He married a Palestinian from Gaza, and they have 2 children, so he's going to stay.
I have 1 minute. Let me give an advertisement. So, as the final part of the answer to your question, we have in the old nursing school building other GCC partners. GCC, help me.
GCC, Great Commission Christian.
There you go, partners who believe similarly as we do, run elementary school.
It's K through 6th grade.
And if you would like to take this on, $500 to support a student at the school for a whole year. A club, a fraternity, no, y'all are above that, aren't you? But however, you guys could do that. I think what we say is this is holding the place of ministry. There are Christian teachers in it. We don't evangelize children, but we do teach them godly principles, and we prepare their hearts. And then, of course, a strong witness to the teachers. So that is the biggest point of ministry that we have there in the Gaza Strip.
So the name of that is the Lighthouse School. If you want to ask us about it afterwards, we'll be glad to tell you more, or you can Google Lighthouse Gaza, Lighthouse School.
It's getting closer and closer.
I know. That means God, we thank you for calling people from all tongues, tribes, and nations. We pray for the Palestinians that you would be glorified in their lives. There would be many worshiping around your throne in the new creation. So in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. Did you want it?
Still not quite.
So much for plenty of time for questions, but we did have a lot of questions, so it worked out okay.
Thanks.